Hello, good morning. Edgardo Sambo here once again. And this time we are now on episode number 21. And the topic for today would be about the law of Moses or the law of Christ. We have heard about the law of Moses and we have also heard about the law of Christ. What are the differences between these two laws? To answer this question, we have to resort to the Bible once more to clarify things. We all know about the Old Testament, which is composed of many books, from the book of Genesis to the book of Malachi. And we also know about the New Testament, which is also composed of many books, from the book of Matthew to the book of Revelation. To make matters more simple, the Old Testament is being guided by the law of Moses, and the New Testament is being guided by the law of Christ. In the book of Malachi, chapter 4, verse 4, it says, "Remember the law of my servant Moses, the decrees and laws I gave him at Horeb for all Israel." Horeb is a Hebrew word for mountain. It is very clear in this verse that it was God the Father who gave the laws to Moses, and God even called this law the law of Moses. In this law of Moses are included the Ten Commandments and all the decrees and laws that the Israelites were supposed to follow during the olden times. As you will remember, the Israelites were the chosen people of God, which God saved from slavery in Egypt. And during the existence of the Israelites until the coming of Jesus Christ, these people were being governed by the law of Moses. To expound more on this verse, it clearly stated that it was God the Father who gave the laws to Moses, and God the Father called these laws that he gave to Moses as the law of Moses. And this law was being followed by the Israelites during the olden times. Let me go to the book of Galatians chapter 2, book of Galatians chapter 6, verse 2, which says, "Carry each other's burden, and in this way you will fulfill the law of Christ." So this time, during the time of Jesus Christ, a law was introduced, and this law was called the law of Christ. When Jesus Christ came into the world, he also established his own laws to be followed by Christians. These laws, which Jesus Christ were implementing, also came from God the Father, and these laws were then called the law of Christ. In the Christian dispensation, we have been following the law of Christ, not the law of Moses. Except, of course, when some of the laws of Moses were retained by the law of Christ, in which an example of this is idolatry. In the law of Moses, idolatry was forbidden, and in the law of Christ, idolatry is still forbidden. Some of the law of Moses were amended by Christ, in which an example of this is adultery. In the law of Moses, adultery was being committed when you had performed the sexual acts with someone who is not your wife or husband. In the law of Christ, this law was amended, in which adultery now is being committed when you lustfully look at a woman or a man. This verse is proven in the book of Matthew, chapter 5, verses 27 to 28, which says, "You have heard that it was said, 'Do not commit adultery.' But I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart." In this verse, you would notice that the law of Christ is stricter than the law of Moses. Some of the law of Moses were totally deleted by Christ, and as an example of this pertains to the law of tithing. The law about tithing was totally deleted by Christ, and in place of this law, Christ had introduced another law which could be found in the book of 2 Corinthians chapter 9 verse 7, which says, "Each man should give what he has decided in his heart to give, not reluctantly or under compulsion, for God loves a cheerful giver." In the law of Moses, tithing was obligatory, in which you are supposed to give to your congregation a 10% of your gross income, while in the law of Christ, you can give whatever your heart desires. It is very clear then that the law of Moses is quite different from the law of Christ. But some of the laws of Moses were amended by Christ, some laws were deleted by Christ, and some laws were retained by Christ. Those laws from the law of Moses that were retained by Christ, we are supposed and obliged to follow that during our Christian dispensation, in which we are now following the law of Christ. In the book of Hebrews, chapter 7, verse 12, it says, "For when there is a change of the priesthood, there must also be a change of the law." In this verse, it states that the old priesthood belongs to Moses, but when Christ came, this priesthood was changed to the priesthood of Christ. And when Christ took over the priesthood, Christ had also changed the law from the law of Moses to the law of Christ. In the book of Acts, chapter 13, verse 39, it says, "Through him, everyone who believes is justified from everything that you could not be justified from by the law of Moses." In this verse, it is very clear then that through the law of Jesus Christ, we could be justified, in which we could not be justified anymore when we follow the law of Moses, except, of course, when Christ himself has retained a certain part of the law of Moses. In the book of Galatians, chapter 3, verses 24 to 25, it says, "So the law was put in charge to lead us to Christ, that we might be justified by faith. Now that faith has come, we are no longer under the supervision of the law." The law being referred to here is the law of Moses. By means of the law of Moses, we had been led to Christ, so that faith will justify us. Now that we had developed our faith in Christ, the law of Moses do not apply to us anymore. We are no longer under the supervision of the law of Moses. It is very clear then that in this verse, the law of Moses, or that word law, which was mentioned in this verse, was put in charge so that it could lead us to Christ, to have faith. Now that we have developed our faith, we are no longer under this law or under this law of Moses. Because when we have developed our faith, we are now under the law of Jesus Christ. In the book of Romans, chapter 10, verse 4, it says, Christ is the end of the law, so that there may be righteousness for everyone who believes. The law being referred to here is the law of Moses. When Christ came and introduced the law of Christ, the law of Moses ceased to exist. By obeying the law of Christ, we are submitting ourselves to God's righteousness. In the book of Matthew, chapter 11, verse 13, it says, For all the prophets and the law prophesied until John. The effectivity of the prophets from the olden times and the validity of the law of Moses ceased to exist during the time of John the Baptist. As you would notice, Christ started his ministry during the time of John the Baptist. Take note, please, that the last of the prophets from the Old Testament is John the Baptist. Because when Christ came to take over, when Christ was born on this earth, people were still being governed by the law of Moses. And in that Old Testament, John the Baptist was the last prophet. In the book of Luke, chapter 16, verse 16, it says, The law and the prophets were proclaimed until John. The law of Moses and the prophets of the Old Testament were only effective until the time of John the Baptist. Because John the Baptist was the last of the prophets of the Old Testament. In the book of Galatians, chapter 5, verse 4, it says, You who are trying to be justified by law have been alienated from Christ. You have fallen away from grace. In this verse, it means that if you keep on trying to obey the law of Moses during the time of Christ, you become alienated from Christ and you have fallen away from the grace of Christ. During the time of Christ until our time, we have to obey the law of Christ, not the law of Moses. The word law here on this verse refers to the law of Moses. In the book of Galatians, chapter 3, verse 11, it says, Clearly no one is justified before God by the law, because the righteous will live by faith. This is actually self-explanatory. If you keep on insisting on obeying the law of Moses, you will not be justified before God. In the book of Hebrews, chapter 9, verse 10, it says, They are only a matter of food and drink and various ceremonial washings, external regulations applying until the time of the new order. The words "the new order" here means the coming of Christ. The rituals being performed during the time of the law of Moses were only effective until the time of Christ. These rituals are what we call a matter of food and drink and various ceremonial washings, like external regulations. These laws were effective only until the time of Christ. In the book of Colossians, chapter 2, verses 16 to 17, it says, "Therefore do not let anyone judge you by what you eat or drink, or with regard to a religious festival, a new moon celebration, or a Sabbath day. These are a shadow of the things that were to come. The reality, however, is found in Christ." The religious rituals being performed by the Israelites during the time of Moses were only being observed until the coming of Christ. The reality is in observing the law of Christ, not the law of Moses. In the book of Hebrews chapter 8, verse 13, it says, "By calling this covenant new, he has made the first one obsolete, and what is obsolete and aging will soon disappear." God had introduced a new covenant in place of the old covenant. That means the law of Moses had been changed to the law of Christ. The old covenant being referred to here is about the law of Moses, and this law of covenant was changed to a new covenant, and the new covenant now is being referred to as the law of Christ. So this old covenant, or the law of Moses, is now being considered as obsolete, and what is obsolete and aging will soon disappear. That means to say the law of Moses had disappeared, and it was then changed to the law of Christ. In the book of Matthew, chapter 28, verse 20, it says, "And teaching them to obey everything I have commanded you, and surely I am with you always to the very end of the age." Jesus in this instance was telling the apostles to teach the people everything that he had commanded. Christ had emphasized everything that he has commanded. That means to follow the law of Christ. Christ did not say to follow the laws of Moses had commanded. With all these biblical verses, I had proven that in our Christian dispensation, we are supposed to follow the law of Christ, not the law of Moses. Let me expound more on this topic about the law of Moses and about the law of Christ. As you would know, the law of Moses was being used by the Israelites as their laws to follow. And these laws of Moses was given to Moses by God the Father himself. And even God the Father himself had called this as the law of Moses. So, an example of the laws of Moses were the Ten Commandments and some decrees and laws that Moses had promulgated. But these laws were only effective during the time of Moses and the Israelites. So the Ten Commandments were only effective during these times. And if the laws of Moses had been changed to the law of Christ, then it is tantamount to saying that the Ten Commandments is not being obeyed anymore in our Christian dispensation or in the time of Christ. In fact, Christ had changed these Ten Commandments to two great laws, which he stated as law number 1, you should love the Lord thy God with all your heart, with all your mind, and with all your soul, and with all your strength. And the second law that Christ had stated was, you should love your neighbor as you love yourselves. These two great laws were in exchange of the Ten Commandments. It was Christ himself who had changed these laws about the Ten Commandments. And if you would ask me, what are the laws of Christ? In fact, the laws of Christ were given by God the Father himself to Jesus Christ, because Jesus Christ alone do not have his own doctrine. The doctrine that Jesus Christ was using when he was ministering his laws to Christians, they were the laws that was given to Christ by God the Father himself. Jesus Christ do not have, or Jesus Christ does not have his own doctrine. Jesus Christ was teaching the doctrines of God the Father to the Christians. Excuse me. So as you would notice, aside from the law of Moses, there's what we call the law of Christ. This law of Christ was given when Jesus Christ was born on earth. That means to say, when God the Father gave this law of Jesus Christ to Christ, the law of Moses was then considered as obsolete and aging, because the old covenant was being compared to the law of Moses, and the new covenant was being compared to the law of Christ. And it says that if you keep on obeying the law of Moses, you will not be justified in front of God the Father, because in the time of Jesus Christ, you will only be justified if you follow the law of Christ, not the law of Moses. In fact, when you keep on following the law of Moses, you become alienated from Christ, and you had fallen away from grace from Jesus Christ. That means to say that the law of Moses is no longer effective in our present time, in the time of what we call the Christian dispensation. In the Christian dispensation, we are now being governed by the law of Christ, not by the law of Moses. In the law of Moses, there are many animals on land and on seas and on the air that you are forbidden to eat or to consume. But in the law of Christ, all these animals, whether on earth, under the sea, or on the air, under the law of Christ, you could now consume all these kinds of meat, because Jesus Christ had now declared that all meats could be eaten by humans, and all meats are clean under the law of Christ. For my fellow Bible-believing Christians, there's a big difference between the law of Moses and the law of Christ. There are some churches all over the world that are still following the law of Moses. They're following the seventh-day Sabbath, which is a Saturday. But under the law of Christ, the seventh-day Sabbath of the week hath now already been changed. Not only you worship God on the seventh day or on the seventh-day Sabbath, in the law of Christ, you could worship God every day of the week, not only on the seventh day of the week or on a Saturday. And the law of Christ is much more stricter than the law of Moses, as what I had said in the law about adultery. In the law of Moses, you will commit adultery when you had performed the sexual acts, not with your wife or not with your husband. You had committed adultery then, during the time of Moses. But on the law of Christ, it is quite different. If you had looked at a woman or you had looked at a man with lust in your eyes, you already had committed adultery in your mind or in your thoughts. That's why the law of Christ is very strict. Although I would like to emphasize that some of the laws of Moses were retained by Jesus Christ, just like idolatry. Idolatry under the law of Moses is prohibited or was prohibited. I'm very sorry. Something went wrong with my throat. It became so itchy, I could not speak. So please disregard the last part of the video. And let me continue, please. As what I was saying, some of the laws of Moses was retained by Christ, like idolatry. Idolatry during the time of the Israelites was forbidden, and during the time of Christ, it was also forbidden. And under the law of Moses, they usually perform these ceremonial washings. They have various food and drinks. But these were only effective during the law of Moses. But during the time of Christ, these practices were not being practiced anymore. And during the time of Moses, or during the law of Moses, there were several religious festivals, like New Moon celebration or a Sabbath day, that were being observed by the Israelites. But during the time of Jesus Christ, or under the law of Christ, these religious festivals were not being observed anymore. So, there is a big difference, or lots of differences, between the law of Moses and the law of Christ. But what is important is that obeying the law of Moses nowadays, during our Christian dispensation, you will no longer be justified in front of God the Father. You now have to obey the law of Christ, not the law of Moses. And when you keep on reading the Bible, you would find out there are many laws of Moses that are now not being obeyed under the Christian dispensation. But unfortunately, there are many people, many Christians, many churches that do not know about this. They do not even know that there's such a thing as the law of Moses, that there's such a thing as the law of Christ. So they keep on preaching to their members that these members have to follow the laws of Moses, the laws that Moses had instituted during his time. They teach their members to follow these laws. But if you're going to check it biblically, these laws are not supposed to be followed anymore, because these laws are now obsolete. In fact, God the Father said that this old covenant or these laws of Moses are now obsolete, and what is obsolete and aging will soon disappear. We are now on the new covenant, or what we call the covenant under the law of Christ. So please take note that the laws of Moses had been totally changed by the law of Christ. And we have now to concentrate ourselves by reading the New Testament, by obeying the New Testament, because the New Testament, the laws of the New Testament refer to the Christians nowadays. These are the laws that we are supposed to follow, to obey, not the old laws of Moses anymore. Except, of course, when part of the law of Moses have been retained by Christ, or part of the laws of Moses have been amended by Christ. I could not state here all the laws that were amended, all the laws that were retained, all the laws that were deleted. It would consume too much time. But let this be a guide for you in reading the Bible. There are words that says law in the New Testament which are being referred to the law of Moses. This is what you have to understand. Not all words law in the New Testament are the law of Christ. No. The law of Christ took only effect. It was only effective when Christ had risen from the dead and ascended to heaven. And that was the time only when the law of Christ had started its, what they call is, when the law of Christ had become effective. So for my Bible fellow believing Christians, please be informed that not all laws are the law of Christ, and not all laws are the law of Moses. The laws of Moses are the laws of Moses. The laws of Christ are the laws of Christ. Those are two different laws. You could not combine these two different laws. In our Christian dispensation, it is strictly that we have to follow the law of Christ. We don't have to follow the law of Moses anymore during our Christian dispensation. I hope that you have understood this topic, the law of Moses or the law of Christ. And please be informed that there are many churches who are still following the law of Moses. But I don't want to mention the names of these churches on this video. In the meantime, I would like to remind you that I am doing my broadcast once every 2 weeks. And 2 weeks from now, I would be discussing episode number 22. So please stay put and follow my broadcast. And if you would like to see my other broadcasts, just go to YouTube and go to the word search. And on the word search, just type my name, Edgardo Sambo. And you will see all my other broadcasts from episode number 1 up to episode number 21. In the meantime, I would say that may God be with us all and bless us all. And please take care until 2 weeks from now when we are going to see each other again. Bye-bye. Thank you for listening.